For me, if you work in insurance, particularly property insurance, you need to know about climate. Climate is here today. It's not something for tomorrow. We see it today. It's going to impact all our results going forward. As a leading insurer, we in AXA invest heavily in understanding climate risk, and that's why we've invested in both climate science and education. It's really important that we get heads around this. It can sound very complicated sometimes, climate school. What we're aiming to do in AXA is demystify some of that for you, give you a better understanding, but also ensure you've got a place to go should you wish to know any more information. Go on to the next slide, please. So what I'd like to do now, so let's look at where you are. So it's 69 of you, 70 people have now had a guess at how many flood warnings and alerts actually were issued in England and Wales following Storm Henk. Do you want to reveal the answer now, Roxy? The actual answer is 745. So it shows you what level of risk there is in the UK, and that's monitored in various places, and we'll come on to that slightly. Now, that's really all from me now in the introduction. Make sure you get your questions in, and I'd like to hand over to Alvaro, who is a member of our AXA Climate business in Paris and is a qualified hydrologist. With that, Alvaro, can I just hand over to you? Thank you.
Thank you, Douglas, for the introduction. Actually, as Douglas mentioned, climate change is changing the patterns, in particular, of precipitation, increasing frequency and severity of flood events globally, but also, and in particular, as probably you are aware of, in the UK. So one of the main natural catastrophes causing most damages in the UK is flooding. And today we are going to discuss about what are the causes of flood risk in the UK, and also the present and future development of flood risk in the different areas, as well as finally the sources. I'm going to provide some sources to quantify and to better understand flood risk in the whole British geography. Next slide, please. So the first topic that we are going to treat today are the causes of flood risk in the UK. We are going to understand what drives flood risk in the UK. Next slide, please. So as we know in the UK, as we have seen in history, there are strong storms that carry a lot of rainfall to certain areas, but also storms that come from the sea and that cause the decrease in pressures and atmospheric pressures, what makes the sea levels to increase during these events, and also winds that come from the sea that push the surfaces of the sea towards the coast, leading to abnormal water levels. And these different causes, these different phenomena causes coastal flooding on one side, but it can also cause extreme local precipitation, flooding local areas, in particular what we call surface water flooding or pluvial flooding. But also these storms can bring a lot of water at upstream basins of rivers, what leads to an increase of river discharges and the consequent overflow of such water courses. And in particular in the UK, we can observe that there are certain, during these events, especially in pluvial flooding events where we see heavy precipitation falling at specific locations, we can see that the drains at some point they are blocked. And this is because in many cases, this type of infrastructure, it's supposed to absorb certain volumes of water, are designed to sustain certain extreme precipitation conditions, but with climate change and the increase of the severity of these events, they are not anymore up to date. And this causes the blockage of the drains, and then therefore the subsequent overflow of these drains, and then the flood of areas in the surface. Next slide, please. So the second topic that we are going to treat today, we are going to have a look at the areas that are most flood prone in the UK on the current conditions, on the current context, but also in a context of climate change. And we are going to see how these patterns of precipitation can affect the different areas. So when we talk about the current conditions, current flood risk in the UK, we can see that the flood risk is driven by England. Among the four nations, we have England that drives the largest number of population affected. If we consider that population affected are those population that are exposed to floods that happen at least once every 75 years. So that's a bit the threshold that we consider to assume that population is affected. We can see that England, especially because of the territory, but also because of the climatic conditions, we see that concentrates from all sources of flooding, so from fluvial, coastal, and surface water flooding, concentrates 1.5 million of population affected, while the whole UK concentrates around approximately 1.9 million of population affected. And this majority of population affected, or the people of population, the amount of population affected is mainly driven by surface water flood risk. Why that? Because surface water can affect everywhere, right? We don't need to be close to a river to have surface water flooding, because if there's extreme precipitation in an area that's far away from the river, we can observe flooding. Well, if we talk about fluvial flood risk, we need to be, this flood risk is conditioned to be close to a river. And when we are talking about coastal flood risk, this flood risk is conditioned to be close to a coastal area, right? So in the case of surface water flooding, it's quite spread. But as we will be able to see in the next slide, please. We have talked about population affected, which is driven by surface water flooding, right? Because it can happen everywhere. But in terms of expected annual damages, which is on average, what is the damage in pounds that is experienced per year, we can see that this figure is driven by fluvial flood risk in this case. And why is that? Because even if surface flooding can occur everywhere, we don't need to be close to a river or be close to the coastline. The water, in the case of river flooding, normally the water depths are much higher and the flow velocities in case of overflow of the rivers are much higher. So the larger speed and a larger flood depth caused by this type of flooding can cause potentially more damages than surface water flooding where we see typically relatively small flood depths and flow velocities that in many cases are not very large. So we can see that the expected annual damage is driven by fluvial flooding, and that the expected annual damage is again driven by England in this case. England has expected annual damage for all sources of flooding of about 291 million pounds. We are talking here about expected annual damages to residential. That's very important to note. Residential properties, and also we're talking here about direct damage. So we're not talking here about business interruption or interruption of activity. We're talking here specifically about direct damage. So 291 million pounds currently for all sources of flooding in England as expected annual damage, and for the whole UK, we're talking about 475 million pounds in this case. Next slide, please. Yeah, so we have framed the picture under current conditions, and now the question is how this flood risk is going to evolve for the different regions, for the different sources of flooding, under different population growth scenarios, because it's very important to note that when we are calculating this expected annual damages, or we're quantifying flood risk, it's important to note that we have one component of the risk, which is the hazard, which basically is which areas are flooded and at which probability. But then there's another very important component of the flood risk, which is the exposure, right? So how many people live in an area? If we have more population living in an area for the same flood extent, we will have more damages in an area that's more dense, right? So we consider another parameter for these future scenarios under population growth assumptions. Also, the temperature increase, right? So we have more pessimistic or optimistic climate scenarios, and particularly driven to increase in temperatures, because the increase in temperature leads to also an increase of the capacity of the atmosphere to capture soil moisture, to retain soil moisture, and to generate more severe and frequent precipitation, right? And then we have another parameter, which is time horizon, right? We are talking here about 2050 and 2080. And then, so in here, what you can see are plots for this different combination of different parameters to generate different scenarios. And just to give the conclusion, because there are many numbers and many bars here, but we observe that England accounts for the greatest increase in the number of people at significant risk of flooding. So we are talking here about absolute values of people at significant flood risk for all climate futures, or for almost all climate futures and sources of flooding, just with the exception of fluvial flooding in 2080s with a 4 degrees Celsius increase and under high population assumption. However, if we talk about relative increase or increase in percentage, it is Northern Ireland which has a higher proportionate increase. So in terms of absolute number of people affected, we see England having the largest increase. But if we talk about percentage increase, because Northern Ireland has a much, let's say, lower number of people at flood risk, we see that Northern Ireland is the one having the largest, let's say, relative increase in percentage of population affected. So the current risk is most prevalent for surface water flooding. And therefore, as a result, in substantial numbers at risk. And as we mentioned before, so surface water flooding, typically we have more population at flood risk. More population at flood risk, right? Because it's more spread. But when we talk about damages, as we mentioned before, it is river flooding which drives the damage in that case. We can also see, as an example in the second plot and the top right plot, that there are some decreases in some cases. And the reason is that under 2050 and 2080 for Scotland, Wales, and Northern Ireland, and under the low population scenario in that case, we see a decrease in the population affected at flood risk. So it is expected that the areas where right now there are a certain amount of population at flood risk, these areas will see a decrease in the population. And that's why we see these decreases in population affected for this particular scenario. Then coastal flooding accounts for the greatest increases, with England and Northern Ireland showing 4, 5, and 6-fold multiples of the current population at significant risk. So, of course, coastal flooding with the increase in sea levels, we will see also an increase in the frequency and severity of the storm surges occurring in the coastal areas in the different countries. And yes, we can pass to the next slide to have a more give a little bit additional figures on the projections on the expected annual damages. So we have seen in previous slide that the expected annual damages for residential properties were at more or less £500 million. And what is estimated is that in 2100 and at pessimistic climate change scenario, which is under 4 degrees Celsius increase by 2100, we could see an increase in expected annual damages for residential properties and for direct damages only from £500 million currently to 1.5 billion in the future scenario. If we would include the indirect damages, this figure could rise even from 1.5 billion to 2.9 billion in 2100 and with this increase of temperature of 4 degrees. So as we can see in the maps here, we can see that at the local level, the largest future flood risk is very evident in coastal areas, including the top 3 risk locations, which are considered Hull, the city of Portsmouth, and also Sedgemoor District Council. It's important to know that in these locations, there are sometimes, there may be some plans for flood risk alleviation, for flood risk mitigation and adaptation, and these analyses do not include those adaptation measures. But if we don't include them, if we do this assumption, these 3, at local level, these 3 locations would experience the highest increase in number of population at flood risk in the future. Next slide, please. And the third topic that I wanted to mention today, to discuss about today, are the sources that are available, publicly available, to quantify flood risk in the UK. So we have discussed before about current flood risk, future flood risk. So we are able to understand the problem, and now with these sources, we should be able to, in some way, estimate, quantify the flood risk, and in that way, be able to structure a solution to it. So the sources that are available in the UK concerning flood risk are provided by the Environment Agency, also the Flood Forecasting Centre, the Met Office, the National Tidal and Sea Level Facility that surveys the coastal the sea levels regularly. But there are also commercial modelers that provide flood risk maps for the whole country. And there are also local associations that are involved in activities of flood risk awareness among population, that have their own alerting system based on water levels recorded, the different sections of the river network, for example, or based on precipitation levels that are forecast by Met Office. So there are different sources. There are sources that are about observation and analysis of historical data. It's very important to analyze historical data because it enables us to understand what is the frequency and severity of flood risk in the different areas. And this historical data is available for rainfall gauges, but also for river gauges, also at tidal gauges at the sea. There are also flood maps that have been already pre-computed by Environment Agency, for example, in which, for example, if we have a property, or we have a client that has a property in a specific location, we are able to identify what's the frequency of the flooding of that location. Is it 1 every 20 years? Is it 1 every 50, 1 every 500 years? And that is very important to also understand what's the risk in that location. But also there are, especially for insurance, one service that are the alerting and forecasting services. That's very important to mobilize, put in place a contingency plan in case there's an alert, and we have some lead time to react, and then minimize or reduce the flood damages due to the imminent potential flood that can occur in a specific location. Next slide, please. So this is an example of a flood map for planning that is generated by the Department for Environment, Flood and Rural Affairs. This map provides the flood areas that are flooded on average once every 100 years or more often across England in this case, and or that are flooded due to river flooding, so once every 100 years or more often for river flooding, due to river flooding, or 1 every 200 years on average or greater, and no probability of sea flooding, of coastal flooding. So we can with the appropriate tools, geospatial tools that actually we have resources internally at AXA. We have experts that work, for example, in geospatial analysis that are able to cross these maps with a portfolio of locations in order to be able to quantify the flood risk at different locations that, for example, of clients across the UK. Next slide, please. Then another very important source that I mentioned before are the river gauges, right? River and rainfall gauges. We also have these resources in the UK, and we have a very dense network of river and rainfall gauges that can be used to understand the flood risk in specific areas. In this case, I put what you see on the left are the points of river gauges across the UK. And then if we select one of the gauges, as we can see on the right, we can obtain the historical time series of the river levels at that specific gauge. And based on these data sets, we can assess the risk of flooding at specific location. And if we can assess the risk, quantify the risk of flooding at specific location, we can also design solutions to transfer this risk, as insurance does. And in this case, I am just going to put the example of parametric insurance, which is an alternative risk transfer that, well, in particularly, we work at AXA Climate, the entity that I work on, and that basically triggers a payout based on the river level that is reached at a specific gauge that has been pre-agreed with the client, with the insured party beforehand, based on the location or the site of the client. And then it's a predefined structure of payouts that are linked to river levels. So as I show here, we have minor flooding, medium flooding, and major flooding. And this minor flooding is linked to a certain payout, medium flooding for a little higher payout, major flooding to a little higher payout. And this type of insurance product is very useful for emergency relief in this case, because since these structures and the payout structures are predefined upstream and agreed between the insured and the insurer, it is very objective, because this data is published by a third party, which is in this case the UK Centre for Ecology and Hydrology. The payouts amounts are predefined, so it's very clear. This source of data is refreshed daily. So this enables objectivity in the payouts, but it also enables speed in the payments. And this enables to react to the client to have available certain capital to invest in emergency relief and emergency recovery. So this is one of the solutions that could be put in place when we use the historical data and where we are able to assess the risk with these river gauges or rainfall gauges. Next slide, please. And just to finish, another very important service that comes out from the real-time monitoring of these river levels and rainfall levels and forecast of these river levels and rainfall levels are the alerting services. Because the alerting, as we know, if we alert about an imminent flood on time with a certain reaction time, we are able to mitigate and to reduce, depending on the sector, but in many cases, a large share of the losses. So there are sources available in the UK, such as this Should Heal gauge map, that enables to know what are the river levels, if the river levels have passed a certain threshold, and based on that, throw alerts, and based on that, activate a contingency plan for a company, property, or client. Next slide, please. Finally, I just wanted to give you the reference because they are very, very interesting reports about flood risk in the UK. You are lucky because I think that the UK is very, very advanced in flood risk management and is very advanced in putting in place and consolidating data sources and resources to quantify flood risk and to act coherently and rationally to mitigate this flood risk. And these four reports managed to summarize very well the flood risk management in the UK and the reasons of flooding in the UK. So I recommend you to have a read. We will share these sources, but the first report is generated by the Geneva Association, gives an overview of flood risk management in the UK, in England in this case. Also, the second report is provided by the Environment Agency. Third report provided by the British Red Cross. And finally, very, 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 very informative report, UK Climate Risk Independent Assessment, which provides a lot of in-detail information about the projections and estimations of flood risk in the future under different scenarios. Next slide, please. So I would like to thank you, everyone, for attending this webinar. I hope that this has been informative. And right now, I will hand back to Douglas.
In closing, can I just thank Alvaro? I know there's a lot of work goes into these sessions. I think it's great now that we're able to bring colleagues from AXA Climate, our global expertise, to give you a slightly different talk than you normally hear from a UK insurer. It gives you the wider part of that. Any further questions, you've got my details, please follow up. This is the second in the series of webinars we've done with AXA Climate, our colleagues in Paris. If there's anything else to do with climate change, sustainability you'd like to hear, please let us know. We're more than happy now to make sure we deliver what you're asking for. And we'll be looking at the third webinar very soon. If you missed the first one, which was much more about climate change science, that is available on the AXA broker websites. You can click download that yourself. We'll include a link to that in the material we send you through, or contact any member of staff in AXA and we can get you these links. So please, if you missed the first one, it's available to download and view. This one as well, we'll get it through to you in the very near future. And please contact us with any thoughts you have with this session. I'd just like to thank you all in closing. Thank you.
Thank you.